Hello and welcome to The Diverse Bookshelf with me, Samia Aziz. On this show, I interview incredible authors doing a deep dive into important themes and issues while talking all things books. On today's episode, I spoke to Eleanor Shearer about her moving debut novel, River Sing Me Home. I flew through this book, which is set in 1834, just after the announcement of the Emancipation Act, which started the end of slavery. Rather than completely abolishing slavery, the act required formerly enslaved people to continue working on plantations for 6 years without pay. In River Sing Me Home, we follow Rachel, who seeks freedom and goes in search of her children who were taken away from her during slavery. It's a really moving and sad, yet hopeful story that encourages us to think with more nuance and complexity about slavery, abolition, freedom, trauma, and grief. Eleanor Shearer is a mixed-race writer and the granddaughter of Windrush generation immigrants. She splits her time between London and Ramsgate on the English coast so that she never has to go too long without seeing the sea. She currently works for a think tank. For her master's degree in politics at the University of Oxford, Eleanor studied the legacy of slavery and the case for reparations, and her fieldwork in St. Lucia and Barbados helped inspire her first novel. Hi, Eleanor. Thanks so much for joining me on the Diverse Bookshelf today. How are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here.
So your debut novel, River Sing Me Home, has been out in the world for a little while now, and it's had lots of attention. Readers up and down the country and around the world have really loved it. And I read it fairly recently, and I too really enjoyed it. I absolutely flew through it. It's a really sad but kind of gentle but very really important story that you're telling, and I think you're telling many stories within the one novel. So just to begin with, if you could please give us a little bit of information and introduce your novel.
Yes, so it's called River Sing Me Home. It's set in the Caribbean just after the abolition of slavery, and it's about a woman called Rachel who's trying to find the children that were taken away from her and sold to different plantations. It's inspired by the women in the Caribbean that we know really did try to put their families back together again after slavery ended. And it takes place across 3 different islands, and as you say, it's trying to encapsulate many different stories of different sorts of people in the Caribbean region at that time, but at its core it's about love and it's about what it means to be free.
Yeah, and I think, we'll get onto this a bit later, like you explore freedom in a really interesting way, like you present us different types of freedom, and the question keeps on coming up again and again, well, what does it really mean to be free? If you could take us back a little bit, like what led you to write this particular novel? Like what really inspired it?
Yeah, so I was 16 and I went to this exhibition about slavery in the Caribbean, and I learned about these women who went to try and find their children after abolition. And the whole point of the exhibition was that it was about resistance to slavery in all its different forms. And one of the great crimes of slavery was its way of destroying people's families. And so I thought it was such an act of bravery and an act of resistance after slavery ended to refuse that destruction, refuse to allow your family to stay broken. And it's also something that's very personal to, my grandparents are from the Caribbean, and even to this day in the region you still have these fragmentations because there's so much migration. My grandparents were part of the Windrush generation, which came to the UK in the 1940s and 1950s, and as part of that they lost touch with a lot of their own family as well. And we in my mum's generation and my generation are only just beginning to put those fragments back together and get back in touch with people like my granddad's sister, who's in Barbados still living and is just turned 90 last year. So it was a very personal subject to me, this idea of family and fragmentation and reconnection, because of that connection I have to the Caribbean as well. So that was what was the core of the novel, the seeds of it, this true story about women going looking for their children, and also this sense I had that it was still so vital to tell Caribbean stories about family, because the echoes of what happened in the time of slavery kind of continue right up to this day.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that I was really fascinated by seeing you talk quite a bit about is the way that slavery erased identity and like people's roots. And there's a bit in the book where it actually talks about the importance of roots and how if you don't have roots, you kind of have nothing, and like, you'll fall away. And I find that really, I related to that so massively. And I think like, especially those of us that come from backgrounds where there have been immigration and there has been a loss of connection to our roots, there becomes this like just this desire to understand where we come from. But you talk about in the book, so we've got obviously like slaves that are living, or enslaved people that are living in across Africa, but they're losing connection to their language and their names before they were given like Christian names, or by the slave masters. And so yeah, I mean, that was like really, really interesting. I understand that you did a lot of research for the book. What was it like reading about that kind of that erasure of identity?
Yeah, so one of the interesting things about the research for this book is that there was some reading, there were texts, but actually a lot of it was done through interviews. So I completely separate to this novel, just because of my own interest in the subject, did a master's in politics where I looked at the case for reparations and the legacy of slavery in the Caribbean. And as part of that master's, I went out to St. Lucia and Barbados, which is where I have family, and was interviewing family members, reparations activists, historians. And so it's why I think the book sometimes has a bit of an oral history feel to it, because it was in a way inspired by that oral history fieldwork, that going out and speaking to people and saying, well, what have you heard about slavery? What has been passed down to you? And definitely there is that sense even today of the erasure, the ways that people have been denied that connection to their heritage. But actually, one of the reasons the book is called River Sing Me Home, singing and song play such a big role, is that's one of the ways that culture and heritage can be passed down. And it was another act of resistance, right, to even in the face of decrees banning it, to still meet for religious ceremonies, for singing, for dancing. And I was reminded of that when I was in St. Lucia doing this fieldwork, because I was asking someone about, what had they heard about the time of slavery? Was anything passed down to them by parents, grandparents? And they just started singing this song, this traditional St. Lucian folk song about the time of slavery. And that was one of the ways that some kind of sense of memory had been passed down. And so I think that the role of singing is really important in the novel and in life as well, is as a way of preserving heritage in the face of such a concerted effort to deny it.
Absolutely. And I think the just focusing on the erasure of identity just adds that kind of complexity or nuance to how we talk about slavery and how we understand what happened. Because at a very basic level, like if you think about kind of primary education in the UK, the idea that we're taught about slavery is that there was this group of people that were forced to work on plantations, and they were treated horribly and they were beaten. It kind of stops at that. We're not encouraged, and maybe part of it is because we're very young, but we're not really encouraged to think about what that means in terms of people's identity and their understanding who they really are. The fact that they were stripped of their names, that they were forbidden from speaking their own languages, and you describe singing as an act of resistance because they were not supposed to be doing it, right? And I remember being at school and remembering watching something or reading something about how they would sing, the women would sing on plantations, but we were kind of told that, they did that to keep their spirits up. But if we look at it as an act of resistance, I think there's something really, really powerful within that. So yeah, I really enjoyed that element of the story. I think it's really important to bring that out. And just on the fact that we talk about slavery so differently in the UK and in the US and as compared to in the Caribbean. So, especially going back to what we're taught at school, we're kind of, we talk about the abolitionist movement in the UK, William Wilberforce, and the fact that there was this, concerted effort, there's like moral grounds in the UK that people wanted to free enslaved people. And freedom was something that the white man essentially gave to the enslaved people. But the reality and the way that it's remembered in the Caribbean, and this really comes across in your book as well, is based on acts of rebellion and resistance. And it almost feels as if freedom is something that people fought for, demanded and claimed, rather than something that was bestowed on them by some like white benevolence. So I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about that, because I feel like that's really critical and kind of at the core of what you've written about.
Yes, you're so right. And I mentioned earlier that I learnt about women going searching for their children at an exhibition, and the exhibition was called Making Freedom. The idea being that we need to think about the process of abolition as something that was fought for, as you say, by enslaved people, that we can't deny their agency by pretending it was just something that the British government did to them. And the other thing I wanted to draw out on the book as well, in the book as well, is I think that we often think about the end of slavery and we never think about what comes after. And it goes back to what we were talking about earlier in terms of identity. You know, what does it mean? How can you start to rebuild a life for yourself after this system is over? And in particular, when in so many ways, just under another name, the system continues. I very deliberately set this book in 1834, which is the year that the Emancipation Act in the British Caribbean came into force, but it said that you had to continue to work without pay for your former master for another 6 years, and that was to kind of quote unquote prepare you for freedom. It was this very racist, very paternalistic idea that people wouldn't be able to know what to do with themselves if they were just released. And even after that period ends, and it ends early in fact because of so much resistance on behalf of apprentices at the injustice of the system, in lots of places, particularly places like Barbados, where the novel begins, where it's a very densely settled island, almost all of the land is plantation and land is owned by white people. What are your realistic options apart from continuing to work on a plantation for very little pay and be exploited by British colonists? So there's a question about, you know, what it means to be free in this system of constraint and this system of exploitation that continues even after the formal end of slavery. So these were all questions that I found incredibly interesting, and I absolutely always knew that I wanted this book to centre the agency of Caribbean people throughout, to show how they were navigating these systems, how they were pushing for, resisting and winning their own freedom, and how it's still possible, even in such a dark time, even under the presence of so much exploitation and suffering, to find joy, to carve out space for yourself. I ultimately wanted it to be an uplifting novel, and I hope it is, because it isn't just about kind of unrelenting suffering. It's about the hope that can still be found, that the love that can still be found, and that space that people make for themselves where they can have a kind of life after slavery has ended.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, it's definitely true. We kind of feel like we're kind of taught that slavery was abolished and that was the end of it. But the very fact that the Emancipation Act of 1834 was not an act of freedom, it kind of just gave it a different name almost, because although these people were working, or they were, contracted or whatever to work for 6 years, they weren't getting paid. They were still treated really horribly. Like, nothing had changed. And that really, especially at the beginning of your book, that kind of comes out, just how resigned people felt in realizing that this doesn't change anything. It's just another way of saying the same thing, which I feel like we see that so much with human rights injustices around the world, that it's just worded differently to make it sound like something nicer and something better, but unfortunately it's just the same. It's just the same thing. So you, in the novel, tell the story of Rachel, who goes in search of her children that were taken from her when she was enslaved, and it's really like it's a really sad and really difficult thing to read about, and a situation that she finds herself in. But how was it like for you carving the character of Rachel? Because I know she was inspired by a real person, but also your research. But still, like, how did that come across? Did you always know that she was gonna be the way that she was? Yeah, how did you develop her character?
Yeah, so she's an interesting mix of drawing on kind of historical documents and drawing on my personal life, because she's inspired by a real woman, Mother Rachel, who features in this oral history text. It was these grandchildren transcribed their grandfather's life story, and he was called Samuel Smith. He was born in Antigua in the 1870s, but because he lived to be 103, he was able to tell his grandchildren in the 1970s his story before he died. And Mother Rachel is his, I think, great grandmother, and she walked across Antigua to find her daughter Minty after slavery ended. So there was that kind of basis for Rachel. But in terms of knowing more about and fleshing out her character, I was really drawing on my mum, my step grandma, my grandma, these black women that I know who, in different ways to Rachel, but still have been through a lot of racism, and thinking about, well, how did they adapt to that experience? Because I think it's something that can't leave you unchanged, but also how are they so much more than just that experience? They're not defined by it. And in particular, I think that all of them are quite quiet, quite reserved people, and Rachel herself is quite quiet and quite reserved. And it's an adaptation to a world that hasn't always treated you kindly, or kind of waiting to see how someone will treat you, waiting to see if you can trust them. But at the same time, there's such a core of strength to them, and also a core of love and hope and optimism. So all of these things I wanted to put into Rachel. I wanted to make sure that she was a character that contained multitudes and had these range of emotions within her. So that was the process of drawing her out of both the history textbooks, but then filling her with this sense of the people that I know in my own life, and how they adapted. All of them are mothers themselves. How have they adapted to being mothers in the conditions that they found themselves in? So all of that was going into her character.
Yeah, and I think she's such a strong character, obviously, and she endures so much, but she is extremely warm and loving. And what we see as well is this kind of, I think, change in her ability to express how she's feeling. I think at the beginning she's very cautious. She's really scared. Well, she's scared for a lot of the book because, she has essentially run away when she's supposed to still be working. So she is scared literally of getting caught because she has witnessed somebody having been in the same situation as her. But so at the beginning she's very cautious. But what we see develop later on is she's just becomes more open to speak about her experiences, but also to show her grief. There's a point where she doesn't really show how much she's hurting or what she's feeling, but it gets to a point where she just can't keep it in anymore, and she just becomes a bit more comfortable in speaking about it. Now, I think that's part of that is kind of like how we deal with trauma. And so we have Rachel, and then we've got one of Rachel's children who has been through something so traumatic in her life that she no longer speaks. I was really fascinated by your decision to include a character that was no longer speaking in that. Where did that come from?
Yeah, a big theme of the novel is what can and cannot be said. And as you say, that really comes back to the idea of trauma and how we deal with trauma and how trauma is passed down. So I think I always wanted a character that sort of took that to the extreme by being literally unable to speak herself. All of the characters in some ways are unable to speak about what's happened to them. And I made a very deliberate choice in the novel. It's about what comes after slavery. It's not one of those novels that's set in the thick of the plantation, in the thick of the violence, but the violence is always there, kind of as a shadow, as something alluded to. People don't need to express it aloud to know what each other has been through. But with the character of Mary Grace as well, the book is also about, in the process of researching it, coming to understand that, and this is where I think historical fiction plays such an important role as opposed to just history, because we're talking about stories, we're talking about people that didn't leave much in terms of written records.
Mm.
There's not much that can be done in terms of some of the traditional kind of white academic modes of history to understand what life would have been like for someone like Rachel, someone that was enslaved, someone that had to go and find her children. And so I was also, I guess, thinking about those silences within history, and you have in Mary Grace the extreme of not even being able to leave behind a written trace, but also not being able to leave behind any kind of oral history or storytelling about what's happened to you either, and how you then are able to allude to and get people to understand your story in other ways. The issue of silence, both as a response to trauma, but also as something that we have to deal with as historians and writers of historical fiction always, that how can you imagine into those silences, imagine into those gaps to flesh out those stories that you won't otherwise read about or hear.
Yeah, and I think that's really, really clever as well, because although we had like the actual silence of Mary Grace throughout the book, so much of any system of oppression is about silencing people. It's about getting them not to speak out about what's going on and who they really are. And it's a tool as to how to keep the status quo, how to stop rebellion, because if people talk even to one another, they're more likely to rally together, and that could lead to an uprising. So I think it's really, really clever. But I think also when we think politically, like we talk about how silence around certain issues can really be deafening. And I think that a lot when it comes to slavery, we kind of have the same narrative in the UK that has been pushed forward about, the abolition, but not enough of the right kind of trying to center the voices of the enslaved, of the people that were previously enslaved, and not enough of that, and not enough demands for reparations, and not, and so the silence in that way is also really deafening. And I think the world over, people silence themselves because you're scared to say certain things. You're worried about the implications of voicing your opinion or voicing who you really are because of the systems within which we live. And also throughout the book, there's a lot of comfortable silence between, especially with Rachel when they're sewing the dresses and they're talking, and there's bits where they will just look at one another and they will know what they're trying to say. And I thought that was really, really beautiful and really profound. And I think even as readers, you're able to read between the lines and understand, even though like we haven't been in the position of either one of those characters and we're not in the room with them. But I think as readers, we're really able to read between the lines. So I thought that was really, really powerful. So obviously throughout the book, our characters, or Rachel's in search for her children, but there is also this idea of freedom, like searching for freedom. It comes up time and time again, what does it really mean to be free? And Rachel has dreams where she's speaking to like the spirits of her children and all kinds of things, trying to understand what a life of freedom looks like, because they haven't been free for so long. And you explore different kinds of freedom. I think you pose to us different questions about freedom. Yeah, and I just wondered if you could talk us through that.
Yeah, so without giving too much away, each of Rachel's 5 children that she's searching for, I think, represent a different way of being free. And I always wanted, setting out on this project, to have those different forms of freedom shown in the novel. And speaking kind of in general terms, a couple that were important to me to reflect on is the idea of rebellion, so armed insurrection. The book features a real rebellion, the Demerara Rebellion, that was in 1823, so it's actually the 200th anniversary of that this year. And that's, I think, almost the most extreme and collective form of fighting for freedom. It's freedom as I will not be free unless everyone else like me is free, so we're willing to take that by force. But then you also have the runaway communities, the people that would have got themselves, maybe if they were incredibly lucky, an immediate family member, but not much more than that, out of the plantation, ran to somewhere where they could live hidden in woods, in mountains, and have a sort of very insecure freedom there. It's quite individual. It's sort of, I am free because I've got myself out of this system, even though I know that plantations continue just over there. It's sort of not my problem anymore. So that's a different method of being free. And then you also have what in a way was one of the hardest forms of freedom for me to write, because it's something that I would not choose for myself. But you do have a mixed race character in the novel who's choosing freedom as a kind of passing, pretending that you're something you're not, pretending that your roots are different than they are. And as someone who is mixed race and can pass for white, it's something I've obviously thought about a lot, and I have chosen to very actively embrace my heritage and not want to deny those roots. And it's very painful in a novel that's all about trying to reconnect with heritage, ancestry, family, to have a character whose method of being free is to deny those connections, deny that ancestry, deny that heritage. But I wanted the book to reflect without judgment all of the different ways that people at the time were choosing to be free, and we have to be honest with ourselves that that's one of the ways that people did choose freedom, that way of cutting yourself off from your family and everyone that you know, and using that to access a privileged space. And I think the point of all of these different modes of being free is that none of them are without risks, none of them are without costs, and it's sort of up to individuals to weigh the balance of what they value. And I wanted to reflect that complexity. And as I say, as I said earlier, reflect the fact that this isn't a perfect world. You know, this is never going to be a novel that ends with Rachel, say, coming into a huge windfall inheritance and being free from all sort of financial, physical constraint. You know, she is a woman who is still at the bottom of the social hierarchy in a British colony at a time of extreme racism. But I still believe that she could be meaningfully free in some senses. And so it's, how do you navigate those constraints that are always going to be on you? How do you choose between the risks, the constraints that you face, and still carve out that bit of space for
Yeah, and I
yourself?
think it's important to reflect as well on the fact that, like, is freedom like absolute and is it concrete? Like, it is always going to be determined by one's circumstances, no matter where you are. And I feel like, I don't know if it's like relative, but I do feel like it's so abstract that it's really difficult to say that this person is free and this person is not free. You know, it's really difficult to, I think, to impose that judgment on something when you don't know and you're not living in that situation. But I am really interested in the element of passing that you had in the book, and it wasn't a huge chunk. That was fairly short section in the book, and what really comes across from Rachel is just her kind of like shock. She didn't see that happening, so there's the shock factor, and obviously like she's hurt as well because she's like, well, I'm your mother, and you know, you're pretending that somebody else is your mother. And obviously like the typical kind of understanding we have of passing is that it's usually somebody of mixed race heritage and they're passing to be white, usually, or whatever, so they're completely disregarding part of their identity. Did you find many cases in your research, or the people that you spoke to, where people were completely disregarding their background in order to live a better life or a more freer life?
Yes, I think the Caribbean context is interesting because lots of the examples of passing that many people will be familiar with are in the American context. And in some ways, the Caribbean was similar in terms of many of the islands had laws like in the US that had these ridiculous percentages that, you know, formerly if you were 128th black, you were legally black.
Wow.
But in some ways, the Caribbean was interesting because, more so than somewhere like the American South, it did have these very fluid communities. It had, not huge numbers, but some numbers of free black people, free mixed race people that would themselves own slaves and might have been free for many generations. And so there was a fluidity there that meant that often the law was operating not as a kind of strict constraint, but it was just a risk that was hanging over your head. So if you were someone who looked, to all intents and purposes, white, you would never be fully free of that anxiety that someone might find out about your truth and your past, but you might. The fact was that it wasn't like, you know, every time you had to go and buy a loaf of bread, you were having to whip out your birth certificate. So there was that space for people to slip into new identities. There was that space for people to forge a new path for themselves, denying the ancestry that they had before. So yeah, passing, I feel like anywhere where there are those racial categories and where there is such a huge benefit to being I think the thing that's interesting about passing, you mentioned earlier that we often typically think of it as, you know, someone who looks white pretending to be white. Obviously, there are so many different forms of passing. There were people that might forge free papers, so they are passing themselves off. They might be incredibly dark skinned, but they are passing themselves off as something they're not. They're passing themselves off as a free black person when in fact they know that their real heritage is as enslaved. And so there's that constant fear of, if that's going to be found out, you might have mixed race people passing themselves off as being free because of their parentage, but in fact they were enslaved. So you I think lots of people will have read Britt Bennett's wonderful book The Vanishing Half, which is obviously all about passing in the American context. But I once saw her speak, and she just said this wonderful thing about how, you know, all of us are in some ways passing all the time. I think when you expand the concept out to fit all those different modes of, you know, presenting yourself as someone who fits in a particular place in the social hierarchy, then you really see it as this very expansive, very complex thing about how you negotiate that sense of your true inner self, what you reveal to the world, what you keep hidden. And obviously at its most painful, passing is that sense of cutting yourself off from your family. But I think, yeah, everyone in the Caribbean at the time, throughout the world, even today, is passing in ways large and small.
And I loved that, what you just said, that Britt Bennett said about how we are all passing in one way or another, and in small ways and in big ways. And I think that is so true. Like, even if we think about the fact that when we're in a workplace, we dress a certain way or we talk a certain way in ways that we wouldn't do outside of that. And, you know, especially I think in certain circles, you have people that would try and deny their like economic background one way or another, to try and fit in whatever way. And it's so, yeah, it's so true. It's very complex. But I guess the thing that it comes down to is intention. Like, are you doing it for your own survival, or are you doing it to manipulate others and to get more money? That's different, right? Like, I think that intention is what really matters. Like, if you're gonna do it to take advantage of people, that's a very different situation. So obviously your book is fiction, and I love reading historical fiction because it really brings to life you know, a time in history or something that happened that maybe we don't know that much about, or we're not talking about in the right ways. I think it can really get us to help look at things differently. But I can imagine that writing historical fiction is difficult, because not only are you trying to bring forward a plot which is fiction, you're basing it so that it's historically correct, inspired by all the right things. How did you get that balance between getting the historical side right and also keeping it like a very creative fiction piece of work?
Yeah, I think, you know, I studied history at undergraduate, but I always think I'm a better novelist than I am a historian, because I always want the story to guide me. To me, the sort of history exists as, number one, inspiration. I really love, you know, seeing those tiny little footnotes of, we know women went looking for their children, or other little fragments of history that you think, wow, there's a story there, and I'd love to imagine into those gaps and into those things that we can never really know because they're just not written in the historical record. So history as inspiration, history as richness and texture and detail, you know, just being able to judiciously place those few details of what it would have looked like, felt like, smelt like to be in this time period, and that has to come from a certain amount of research. And then a little bit of history as constraint. You know, I often set out and say, so in this case I said I want to tell this story and I want it to be a woman searching for her children, and I want it to be set in 1834, and that then impose certain constraints on me in terms of plausibility, because the slave trade was abolished in 1807, and that didn't mean that people stopped selling enslaved people between different British islands, but it did reduce the amount that people were kind of taken from plantations and the plausible ways they could have ended up in other islands. So the choice to set the novel in Barbados, Trinidad, and Guyana was around the fact that we know historically the largest movements of people in that time period were from islands like Barbados that were very wealthy and very densely settled, to places like Trinidad and Guyana that were recent British colonies and still had lots of land that wasn't yet cultivated, so they were trying to get more labourers in to have more plantations. So there's a little bit of that sense of, I've got a story I want to tell, how can I make it fit the history, what do I need to make it plausible, but I'm always letting the story above all guide me. And I think that's what's so wonderful about historical fiction, and in particular the great challenge and the great excitement is, and all of my favourite historical novels are like this, that sense that you're in a really unfamiliar place and time, but you always have to have your anchor, you have to have your feeling that is universal. You know, if you think about the real greats like Hilary Mantel and the Thomas Cromwell series, you're in such a different worldview, but who can't relate to kind of an ambitious outsider trying to kind of climb the greasy pole? And so you're rooting for this person even though actually their whole framework and frame of reference and ways of thinking about things are so different to yours. And so even though this is a very particular story in a particular place and time about the Caribbean after emancipation, I think that idea of a mother's love is so universal that it gives you your way, and it gives you a way into understanding what it would have been, what it would have felt like, even though, you know, almost all of us alive today don't know what it's like to be enslaved. We don't know what it's like to be a woman like Rachel in 1834. But all of us, whether or not we are mothers ourselves, understand that idea of the intensity of love within families. So yeah, that's one of the exciting challenges of historical fiction as well, as how you find that way in. And I think that's something that you can't get from the history books. I think that's something that you have to imagine and create those. It's sort of about what it means to be human, isn't it? What are the emotions that animate us all, and what do you think has endured through history, and how can you use that to drive your story?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, and that, I think, it is the actual reason why I love historical fiction so much, is because of the heart and the emotion that comes out, because so many historical sources lack that. I mean, unless we have like diary entries and stuff, but like so many historical textbooks, for example, are a lot more informative about what happened rather than expressive about how people would have been feeling. And also about your point about plausibility, I did find in the book that there, especially kind of like as it progressed, a couple of the ways that Rachel found her children just felt very convenient or like very quick, which I don't think would have actually been the case. And it's just a reminder as well, I think, that this is a piece of fiction. You had to finish the story, like you had to move the story along. And it, you know, with fiction, we don't expect everything to be 100% realistic. And I guess that's the beauty of fiction as well. But you still kind of bore out the circumstances. But I was just, especially when she found, you know, when they just arrived, which island was it? And she was like, "Oh my God, that's my daughter!" Literally, like straight away. And I was like, "Whoa, that's actually unreal."
Yeah, no, you're very right. But it's also I think a slightly a genre thing, because I am very enamored with the sort of Latin American Caribbean magic realist tradition, and I almost wanted there to be this kind of folkloric quality, because I think it's not just the kind of coincidences in terms of seeing the children or being able to stumble across them, but it's also the number of people in the story that help Rachel, and she wouldn't be able to find the children without that help. And I think that's another thing. If you wanted a kind of very strictly realist historical novel, might stretch credulity, but I wanted it to have that folkloric quality of the traveller on the journey, and they meet the person on the road that just so happens to give them the weapon that they can use to slay the dragon or something. It's everything fits together, and that's quite a deliberate choice. And yeah, if you're coming to this looking for this like painfully recreated, exactly historically accurate story of what a woman would have gone through to try and find her children scattered across the Caribbean, I think you'll be disappointed. But if you're coming to this for that wider sense of story and that wider sense of, yes, almost a kind of folkloric magic realist journey that the protagonist goes on, then hopefully you'll enjoy it.
I mean, it's not all it doesn't all feel like unrealistic, especially in the beginning. Like there's a sense that this might take quite some time, it's not straightforward. But you know, I do think as well, like we have to be honest in that your book is 380 pages long, or however long it is. If it was 1,500 pages, then we could have had a bit more of a, you know, a bit more of an adventure and an understanding of maybe there would have been more steps. But still, I think a really great story. So there is obviously exploration of like love and grief and trauma, and also like finding love. So why did you decide to have a love story emerge within the book as well?
Yeah, it's interesting because it wasn't, I guess, plan A. I'm somewhere between a sort of outliner and a discovery writer in terms of how I like to write a draft. So with this book, when I started out, I knew exactly how it would end. I always need to have that with a draft, so I had exactly the ending image in mind. And then obviously there are 5 children and 3 islands, so I sort of knew, okay, this is where each of the children are, this is what's happened to them. And as I was going, I was sort of discovering a lot of the secondary characters were invented as I went along to help answer that question of, well, how is Rachel going to get from A to B? How is she going to go from finding this child to finding the next one? And the love story you allude to, which is between Rachel's daughter, Mary Grace, and this character they meet on their journey called Nobody. Initially, Nobody was meant to be a secondary character in the vein of lots of the others in the novel, where he would be around for a little bit, maybe give them a bit of help, and then recede again as they continued on their journey. And it was only because I enjoyed writing him, and actually also was conscious of the fact that it's a very female book. Another deliberate choice I made is not to go into details of who the children's fathers are. There are hints in the book, and I know in my head who those people would have been, but it's not part of the story. And so the idea of having a character on the journey with them that would bring that sense of male energy, I think, was important. And also, I wanted this book to be hopeful, uplifting, and give a sense of something new emerging. Like I say, it's a book about what comes after slavery, so you want to get this sense that life will continue and there will be opportunities for new life, new hope, and growth. And so in that sense, once I had these two characters together on the journey, I thought, well, what's more fitting of a sense that, you know, these generations will continue than two people falling in love with each other? Is this idea that even after everything that's happened, and obviously in lots of ways the love that binds Rachel to her children is still, it transcends slavery, but it's still rooted in it. You know, that's a love that was forged on the plantations that she has sustained through the loss of the children. And so it's still, in some ways, a reaction to, a response to her trauma, whereas the love between Nobody and Mary Grace is something that genuinely arises out of the aftermath of slavery. It is a love made in freedom. And so I think it was quite nice to have that, showing the possibility of all people after they emerge from the shadows of slavery to find new love and form new connections, and not just to try and put together the pieces of what they had before.
I mean, and I think we could tell early on, I think when Nobody was introduced, that there was going to be something, because, you know, you write about in the book about how Mary Grace instantly becomes relaxed around him, and, you know, she kind of wants him to stay around, but she isn't speaking, so she doesn't say anything, but Rachel picks up on it, and so Rachel's like, no, you must stay with us. And we kind of know that something is gonna develop, but it was in the background and really gently done. And I just think it really helped bring out hope, which is important in such a difficult story, in such a difficult time. So for anyone that might want to read more around the things that you've written about, do you have any recommendations of where they can look, what they should be reading?
Yes, I do. So there's a writer called Andrea Levy, a British Jamaican novelist, and she's probably best known for her work Small Island, which is about the Windrush generation, but she also has a beautiful novel called The Long Song, which is all about the end of slavery in Jamaica. So that's a wonderful piece of historical fiction that I think she really inspires me, because she is able to strike that fine balance between parts of history that have darkness to them, but also stories that are joyful and uplifting and show the kind of human moments in and amongst that darkness. So The Long Song is very much like that, as is Small Island. Then Marlon James, the Jamaican author, also has a book called The Book of Night Women, which is, if you're interested in kind of resistance to slavery, but also I think if you're interested in moral complexity, what I love about that book is because it's so centered around the lives of enslaved people and the resistance. Not all of them are good. I think, you know, sometimes you can take these periods of history and make them very literally black and white. You know, you have the evil overseers and plantation overseers, and you have the good, noble, resisting slaves, and that in itself is kind of paternalistic and patronizing. So what I love about the Book of Night Women is that some of the characters are just so unforgettable in their real moral greyness, and so it's very hard to know who you should root for and why. So that's a wonderful book as well. And then finally, this is slightly adjacent to the islands that I'm writing about, but I've always been fascinated by the Haitian Revolution, and its place in the history of resistance to slavery is so important, you know, creating the first independent Black republic outside of Africa. And so much of what happens in the abolition story in Britain is around reactions to Haiti, fears that what happened in Haiti will happen in Jamaica and Barbados if the British don't get a handle on it by abolishing slavery. It's effectively abolishing slavery to keep the colonies. And there's a Trinidadian writer called C.L.R. James, who's written a historical non-fiction book called The Black Jacobins that's all about the story of the Haitian Revolution. So that's a wonderful history book as well, if anyone's interested in this question of resistance in the Caribbean.
Thank you. Those all sound great. I will definitely put those in the show notes. What was your favourite part, writing-wise, in terms of this novel? What did you enjoy writing the most?
It's probably too much to say the end, but it really is because I write drafts in order. I know some writers that kind of jump around scene to scene, but I start at the beginning and I go through to the end. And I mentioned earlier that I always have that ending image in mind when I start, and when it gets tough, because it's such a marathon writing a novel, the thing I am kind of crawling towards is that ending and wanting to emotionally earn the ending that I have in my head. So I do think that the most moving moment in this process was when I finally got to write that ending scene that by that point had been in my head for about 7-8 months as I've been, typing away, getting the whole draft together. Finally got to write those last moments. That was very, very emotional.
Oh, I can imagine. My goodness. And so what do you really hope that people will take away from your novel?
I hope that they will take away a richer understanding of the Caribbean and this point in history, and a more nuanced understanding of abolition, but also in a more general sense, I hope that they take away a feeling of hope and optimism, because as I say, it's meant to be an uplifting story. It's meant to be, I think, we're so used to not just the historical story around abolition, but also we're so used to seeing particular kinds of stories about slavery, and often those are very, very harrowing, very difficult, very violent. And that's not to say there's no place for those forms of art. I think they can absolutely serve their purpose, but I think it is really important that we see more than that, and we see how people led full, rounded, rich, hopeful lives with love in them. So I hope that people take away a sense of that love and that hope.
Yeah, and I think with Black history generally, so much of the stories and the narratives are dark or sad or hopeless, or they lack that joy and that happiness. And I think this is a complaint that we feel even in modern day representations of Black people. Like there's so much trauma one way or another, whether it's like a Black character that's just going from bad relationship to bad relationship, for example, but where's the joy and where's the happiness and where's the success? So yeah, I really do hope that people do take that away as well. And lastly, you have mentioned earlier on, I don't know if that was before, that you are working on a second book. Can you tell us about what we can expect from you moving forwards?
Yes. So my next book is a love story, and it's set in Nova Scotia in the 1790s, and it's about two women who have ended up there through different paths, but in a way it's covering similar thematic ground about what it means to be free, because what I did not know about Nova Scotia until recently was that two groups of formerly enslaved people ended up there in this time period. So African Americans that had fought for the British in the War of Independence and won their freedom that way, often fleeing their plantations in the American South. And then they were sent to Nova Scotia after the war ended, because obviously the British lost. And then you also have these Jamaica Maroons, these runaway slaves who'd lived in the mountains in Jamaica, and a group of them started a rebellion and were deported to Nova Scotia. So you have these two very different groups with very different histories, and it's a love story between two women who are part of these communities. So yeah,
that sounds great. I can't wait to see what else you work on, and congratulations again on the publication of this really great book, and thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much to Eleanor for her time today and for leaving us with so much to think about. I loved speaking to her, and I really hoped you enjoyed listening to this episode. If you enjoyed the podcast, please follow the Diverse Bookshelf on your podcast platform of choice and connect with me on social media. I would really appreciate it if you could rate and leave a review, as it helps more people find the podcast.